Hello, friends at First Baptist Greensboro. This week, we're talking about one of my favorite stories in the book of Acts. The story, not often read, of a disciple named Philip encountering an unnamed Ethiopian eunuch on a lonely road. The imagination this week is that God calls us to nowhere. That nowhere's in quotations, and we'll talk about why in the body of the talk. But I want to reflect on that a bit before we get started. I don't know about you, but this world feels really disrupted these days. It's hard to imagine what the next day will look like, let alone the next week, the next month, the next year. So much uncertainty, so many things happening that are unprecedented, things that we haven't seen before. It feels like our future feels like a nowhere, a place we haven't been before. That the patterns that we are used to expecting in our politics and in our public health and in our schools, we can't seem to lean on those assumptions these days. Our future feels like a nowhere because we don't know what it's going to be like. We don't know what it's going to feel like. We don't know how things are going to go. One of the gifts of the book of Acts is that so often we learn that these moments that feel unanticipated have been anticipated by our forebears in the faith, but especially by a God who walks through us in all these moments. In moments of certainty and uncertainty, doubt and faith, when we're sure and we're not so sure about what comes before us, God has always been with us. And in fact, God has gone ahead of us. I think that's what we're going to find in our story today. God is always moving ahead of us. Enjoy, friends. Hello, friends. Good to see you all. Thanks for joining me again. Over the last few weeks, we have been working through the book of Acts, trying to treat it not like a rule book for putting together the perfect church, but as a source, an imaginative source, a narrative source for imaginations that might guide us in times of complexity, in times of wondering what the future looks like, in times when sometimes our worst instincts, our impatience, our greed, our anxiety might be driving us. Again, we've been wondering, what if we don't just treat this as a way to put together a perfect church, but as sites of inspiration for us? That we take these stories and we don't try to just paste them onto our everyday lives, but to find other ways for us to encounter the imaginations that God is stirring in us and among us in unexpected ways. Our imagination this week is that God calls us to nowhere. That God calls us to nowhere. Just notice the quotations around that nowhere. We'll come back to that here in a second, but God calls us to nowhere. To engage in that imagination, I want to take us to Acts chapter 8, starting in verse 26. It's one of my favorite stories in the book of Acts. It's a really fun story. It's rich, it's layered, it's complex. And I think offers us all sorts of interesting questions about what God is up to in our midst today and also in the past. So the story starts again, chapter 8, verse 26. And if you do have a Bible, I would encourage you to get it out and take a look at it. We're going to notice something about our Bibles near the end of our time together. So Acts chapter 8, starting in verse 26, starts like this. Then an angel of the Lord said to Philip, "Get up and go toward the south to the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a wilderness road." So Philip got up and went. So we have to know a couple things before we get into the story. One is that we need to remember who Philip is. Now, Philip was one of the 7 deacons chosen by the church in its earliest days. There was a conflict in this early church between the widows of the Hellenists and the widows of the Hebrews. So this debate, the disciples got together and decided we're going to pick these 7 deacons, and their one job is to make sure that everyone is fed equitably at this table. It's a striking reminder for us that even in the early days of the church, there's conflict and there's disagreement, and that even then leadership needs to intercede to help tend to and nurture the community. It wasn't perfect for them from day one, as we learned last week with Ananias and Sapphira. So Philip, remember, was given one job, very important job, to make sure that everyone is fed equitably in this community. But notice what happens here is that the church says to Philip, you have this one job to do. And the Spirit comes along and says, I need you to do all these other things too. It happens with Stephen in chapter 7. And now here in chapter 8, we find Philip not waiting on tables, not tending to them, but being called to unexpected places to proclaim the gospel to unexpected people. So that's Philip. The other piece about this is the instruction that the angel gives. The angel tells Philip to go basically to the middle of nowhere, to a wilderness road. And if we've been reading Luke, the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles and paying attention, we might remember a story where somebody went on a wilderness road, on a deserted road all by themselves. We might remember the story of the Good Samaritan. And Philip might wonder, is this such a good idea for me to go to a lonely, dangerous wilderness road? But I'm always struck by the very short sentence right after this. So he got up and went. Philip is portrayed here as this deeply faithful follower of Jesus, drawn by the voice of God. Philip goes wherever the voice of God calls him. So the story goes on. Now there was an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official of the Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of her entire treasury. They had come to Jerusalem to worship and were returning home. Seated in their chariot, they were reading the prophet Isaiah. So we meet Philip, and then we meet this unnamed Ethiopian eunuch, who we learn is this extraordinary person. We learn that they are a high official in the Ethiopian kingdom. We learn that they are a deeply trusted person. They are in charge of the entire treasury. We learn that they are deeply faithful to the traditions of Israel in some way, because they have traveled from a far, far distance to come to Jerusalem and to worship. We also know from this that this Ethiopian eunuch is an extraordinarily learned person as well, because they have the ability probably here to read a Hebrew scroll. And it also tells us the Ethiopian eunuch was probably quite well off as well, because these scrolls, these books, were quite expensive in the ancient world. So we encounter this person who is wealthy, powerful, educated, all these things. But also we encounter someone who is here called a eunuch. In Deuteronomy, eunuchs are prohibited from drawing too near to the presence of God, which probably means that even though this Ethiopian eunuch has traveled all the way from Ethiopia to Jerusalem to worship, they could only draw so near. Later on in Isaiah, Isaiah will imagine all the nations of the world coming together to worship together the one God of the universe on the mountain of God in Jerusalem. And at the farthest edges of belonging, at the farthest edges of all the people that are drawn together, are eunuchs. That eunuchs and the ancient imagination are seen as these deeply powerful people, but also deeply marginalized people in their own way. I think we might also notice too that the Ethiopian eunuch then would have been somebody whose body would have borne a complex gendered identity, one that's incredibly complicated in antiquity for lots of different reasons, but that they're bearing with them this complex gendered identity. So we have somebody who's incredibly powerful, wealthy, educated, but also marginalized in their own way. Super interesting character in this narrative. So many questions that I want to ask about the Ethiopian eunuch, but this is the details that Luke gives us. So the story goes on. The Spirit said to Philip, "Go over to this chariot and join it." So Philip ran up to it and heard them reading the prophet Isaiah. One thing I love about this little text here, that little phrase, join it, it literally says, go over to this chariot and glue yourself to it, attach yourself to it. And I think this is meant to be a really comical scene, but I think we miss it. So you have to imagine that Philip is out here in the wilderness, in the middle of nowhere. The chariot is clopping along, probably moving at some speed. And Philip starts running next to this chariot. And he's breathless and he's sweaty and he's trying to catch up with the chariot and also talk to the Ethiopian eunuch, as we'll find out here. So imagine Philip, breathless, sweaty, running next to it. And he asked, "Do you understand what you are reading?" Or better yet, if we imagine Philip all out of breath, do you understand, right? He's running out of breath. Do you understand what you are reading? And the Ethiopian eunuch replied, how can I, unless someone guides me? And they invited Philip to get in and sit beside them. An extraordinary moment in this story. Imagine if you are a person of means, of power, a person of education, and you're off in the middle of nowhere, and all of a sudden some sweaty, breathless guy shows up. And Philip, we're not quite sure, we can't know for sure, but Philip may not have been able to read. It wasn't a common skill throughout antiquity. But this educated, wealthy person sees this sweaty, breathless stranger next to him, asking, do you understand what you are reading? If I were the Ethiopian eunuch, I would have asked the driver to go faster, to leave this guy in the dust. But instead, the Ethiopian eunuch, with this note of humility, says, how can I unless someone guides me? How can I unless someone guides me? People of means, people of wealth, people of education, people of power, we're not used to asking for help from anybody, let alone some sweaty, breathless stranger in the middle of nowhere. It's an extraordinary story. So you can read it in the text, but Philip gets in there, and they read some Isaiah together, and Philip starts preaching the gospel to this Ethiopian eunuch. And the story continues then later on. So go with me to verse 36. As they were going along the road, they came to some water. And the eunuch said, look, here is water. What is to prevent me from being baptized? And if I'm reading this, I'm thinking, well, there's all sorts of reasons that would prevent you from being baptized. You're a foreigner, you're a eunuch, you're a wealthy, rich, powerful person. And sometimes in the Gospel of Luke has wonders about rich, wealthy, powerful people and how they belong in this community of believers. But most importantly is this. There's a lot of scholarly debate about the Ethiopian eunuch's religious identity. Did Luke think the Ethiopian eunuch was a Jew or was a Gentile? This is an important question because up to this point, only fellow Jews have received the good news of Jesus and been baptized. This community that's forming, this community that we've been reading about for all these chapters, it's all Jewish people. There's not been a Gentile to join in their midst. So if the Ethiopian eunuch is a Gentile, there's yet another reason that would prevent them from being baptized, because they're a Gentile. They're not a part of this community. Again, there's lots of scholarly debate about this, but I'm convinced that the Ethiopian eunuch is a Gentile. There's all these reasons, again, that would preclude this Ethiopian eunuch from joining this community. Right after this, it says, they commanded the chariot to stop, and both of them, Philip and the eunuch, went down into the water. And Philip baptized the Ethiopian eunuch. When they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord snatched Philip away. The eunuch saw him no more and went on their way rejoicing. But Philip found himself at Azotus. And as he was passing through the region, he proclaimed the good news to all the towns until he came to Caesarea. The answer is given in the narrative. In the middle of nowhere, in a desolate place, there's water, and there's baptism, and there's belonging. There are no questions asked here, no limitations to the expansiveness of God's grace. In the middle of nowhere, God's grace is to be discovered in the waters of baptism. There's one more reason why that should have prevented the Ethiopian eunuch from being baptized, and that's that the Ethiopian eunuch is not with one of the stars of the book of Acts, not with Paul or with Peter, but with Philip. I joke sometimes that it's like going to a movie and you think you're going to get George Clooney, but you're stuck with Adam Sandler. He's not a main actor in this. And I'm struck that it took a no one, so to speak, in the early church to go to nowhere to expand the reach of God's grace, to draw together even more people into this community that's being formed. And the other thing I'm struck by is that once Philip is taken away, the eunuch saw him no more, but went on their way rejoicing. And where might they have gone? Presumably they went back home to Ethiopia. In ancient cartographical imaginations and with ancient historians and ancient map makers, when they imagine the ends of the earth, they imagine places like Ethiopia. So I wonder, if one of the sneaky things that's happening here is, if you think back to Acts chapter 1, verse 8, there Jesus commissions the disciples to be my witnesses into Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. And I'm left wondering, what if the gospel reaches the ends of the earth by this Ethiopian eunuch whose name we do not know? What if the good news of Jesus reaches the ends of the earth and the church has no idea it's happened? And what if the Ethiopian eunuch was the first Gentile convert, but the church had no idea it happened because it was Philip that was doing it and not Paul or Peter? In what ways is the Spirit moving among us in unexpected ways, in ways that we might not notice, but in ways that show us what God is up to in the shape of God's future? I don't imagine that any of us is going to get a text this afternoon saying, go find an Ethiopian eunuch in a carriage in the middle of nowhere somewhere. But God may call you to do something that seems foolish, extraordinary, unwise. And maybe you'll take a few brave steps and go out to what you think is the middle of nowhere. You'll take all these brave steps and you'll get there and you'll encounter somebody who needs to hear the good news of Jesus. Or better yet, you'll encounter someone that changes how you understand who Jesus is. And in the middle of nowhere, there's water and there's baptism and there's rejoicing and there's belonging. And then when you look back at the road that you've taken, at every step, every brave step that you took to go to this middle of nowhere, you discover that each and every step that you've taken thus far was paved by God. That God, apparently, is in the business of making nowhere God's own home. That God is always going ahead of us to all those places we think are nowheres. There's one more little wrinkle to the story. So again, if you've got the Bible in front of you, if you can take a look at it, look for where the Ethiopian eunuch asks, what is to prevent me from being baptized? In what verse number does the Ethiopian eunuch ask that? You'll notice that's in verse 36. Trick question for the day is, what number comes after 36? And if you look in your Bibles, you'll notice that verse 36 goes to verse 38. And you might wonder, well, what happened to 37? Was there a misprinting? Something went wrong here? And most of your Bibles will have a little footnote right after 36. And you follow that to the bottom, it'll say something like this. Other ancient authorities add all or most of verse 37. And Philip said, if you believe with all your heart, you may. And they replied, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. So what's going on here with this verse 37? You'll remember that there are thousands of manuscripts of the New Testament. Not two of them are exactly alike. And this is one place. So it's most likely, we think, that Luke did not write verse 37. Instead, Luke wrote the story with 36 and 38. Again, he wasn't numbering the verses as he went along, but somewhere along the way, somebody decided, whoa. There is one thing that prevents the Ethiopian eunuch from being baptized. The Ethiopian eunuch didn't say the right words. They didn't pray the right prayer. As we said in my Baptist upbringing, they didn't accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior and walk down the aisle to do so. There was one thing that was missing. They had to say the right words. They had to confess. And I think we do this sometimes in our communities and our churches. We add verse 37s around us. We add boundaries to belonging around our communities. A lot of churches have a sign up front that says all are welcome, but I think sometimes we mean like this, right? We're kind of saying all are welcome, but kind of at arm's length as well. All are welcome as long as you don't try to change us. All are welcome as long as you become like us. All are welcome, but don't ruffle our feathers too much. Verse 37 kind of ruins the story. Because the story as it stands is the Ethiopian eunuch says, what is to prevent me from being baptized? And there's water, with no intervention of a question, with no intervention of a need to come to Jesus in the ways that we have known, the ways that we have seen. Instead, God makes nowhere God's own home. So again, our imagination for this week is God calls us to nowhere, with quotes around it. In short, what if God is calling you to a nowhere these days? And that nowhere may not be some deserted road. It may be your neighbor, it might be a community over, or it might just be an uncomfortable place for you. But God might be calling you to that nowhere. But what if we assume that God has already made nowhere God's own home? How might that change our lives? How might that shape our walk of faith? Let's close with a few questions that you might engage with one another, with some friends, with some family. Number one, when has God called you to do something that at first blush seemed foolish, unexpected? What did you learn when you followed God's strange call? Number two, when you think of nowhere, what comes to mind? What keeps us from following God to those nowheres? And last, to look back at a verse that we skipped, look at verse 35. There, in verse 35, Philip proclaims the good news about Jesus, but Luke does not write down what he says. In one sentence, what is the good news of Jesus for you? Again, thank you, friends, for joining me today. We've got one more week, one more set of imaginations that we'll engage next week. We will see you then.